Welcome to this session of History 2. This one's dealing with Woodstock and Altamont. In some ways, I should maybe have retitled this The Dream Realized and Then the Dream is Over, because Woodstock in many ways is the realization of the dream. There were problems, as we'll see, with it and its execution, but overall, it went better than should have been expected. Altamont went far, far, far worse. We'll be focusing a bit on the artists Janis Joplin and Santana, his band, but we'll be mostly talking about these large festivals. That's the main focus of our attention today. Woodstock. This is the peak of the outdoor festival. And remember, the outdoor festival is not terribly old at this point. There have only been a handful of them, depending on whether or not you count the Human Being. You had the Montreux Rock Festival. You had the Monterey Pop, of course, being the most prominent prior to Woodstock. But really, in many ways, Woodstock is the culmination of all this. It was held from August 15th to August 17th in 1969 on Max Yasgur's dairy farm in Bethel, New York. It was billed as an Aquarian exposition, 3 days of peace and music. The reference here is, of course, to astrology, to the age of Aquarius. So, see, for an example, the influence of this astrological notion on pop culture, the musical Hair, right? The Age of Aquarius is a big song there. The Aquarian age is supposed to be an era that's characterized by electricity, rebellion, nonconformity, peace, idealism, and humanitarianism. Now, of course, there's a tricky aspect there, right? Peace usually arises, at least nominally, or at least through most experience, or at least seemingly, through some kind of conformity, to everybody conforming to the same mores, to the same normative values. But here, the Age of Aquarius is meant to combine rebellion and nonconformity with peace and idealism and humanitarianism. It's not that that's an impossible goal, I would like to think anyway. It just is a difficult one. And that puts a kind of high watermark, or it puts a high bar that one has to pass here, right? It was thought to be an era that was beginning around that time and was posited as the possibility of utopia, the idea that maybe we can really have this sense of individualism that's implied by nonconformity, that we can each be ourselves and yet still attain peace and idealism and humanitarianism. That's such an interesting thing to be concerned with anyway, right? I mean, the people who are interested, there's sort of various levels of what we might consider humanitarianism. There's the idea of being charitable to the underclass. We often think of that as humanitarianism, and I don't want to suggest that it's not. But there's often an implication there that you're helping them to live or whatever, but you're not taking them. They're still the underclass, and to a certain extent, the way that capitalism often works and the way that U.S. culture has often worked is that the underclass has to remain an underclass for there to be a upper class and a middle class, right? That would be, let's say, one level of humanitarianism. Another would be that humanitarianism really means allowing people to, or fostering the possibility of people realizing potential. Now, in one sense, you can't realize potential. Human beings are. I would say a good percentage of a human being is that potential, is that openness, that nonconformity, that electricity, if you will, that resistance to the way things are and the way I have been in the past to what I might become, to what's possible for me. The might over the is or the ought, right? Instead of saying that things ought to be this way or things are this way, we think about the ways things might be. That's potentiality, that's a possibility. And that to me is a different form of humanitarianism that is the one that I think is attempting to be, at least ideologically, be fostered by things such as Woodstock. So at least 400,000 people were in attendance. And again, the exact statistics are hard to come by, but at least 400,000 people were there. It was designed as an alternative community, even though it was a temporary one. They created their own hospital, dining areas, etc. And for 3 days, it was the second biggest city in New York, second only to New York City. 18, so it's bigger than Buffalo and Albany and so on, as far as population is concerned. You had to pay $18 for advance tickets or $24 at the gate, but it soon became a quote-unquote free concert because there were a ton of gate crashers, people who didn't pay and just got in anyway. Here are the organizers, and you can see we're dealing with 4 fairly different people. We have Michael Lang and Artie Cornfield, Joel Rosenman, and John P. Roberts. The latter 2 were entrepreneurs who had just built Media Sound, a complex of recording studios in Manhattan. And they were thinking this as a way of sort of drumming up business and making it, giving some focus to Media Sound. Cornfield and Lang were attempting to open a smaller studio in Woodstock, and together the 4 decided to promote a festival that would feature bands of the counterculture. They were nearly bankrupted by the venture, owing to the gate crashing, but it's the film ultimately that saved them financially because they all got a piece of it. They all had some of the film and recording rights. And so when it was released in 1970, that recouped their losses and actually made them a good bit of money. But had it been just a concert, they would have been bankrupted. The concert itself did not bring in the revenue to match the costs. And there were a bunch of bands. Creedence Clearwater Revival, they were the first to sign. They're often forgotten as part of this because they're not as heavily featured in the film. I'm trying to remember if they are featured in the original cut of the film at all. In the extended version, they are. The Grateful Dead, their set culminated in a 50-minute version of the song "Turn On Your Love Light." Jefferson Airplane, of course, Janis Joplin, The Who, Jimi Hendrix, Country Joe and the Fish had a very memorable set that was featured and emphasized in the film. Santana, of course, had a huge moment both there and in the film and in his career surrounding Woodstock, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Crosby, Stills, and Nash were there, Joe Cocker, Sly and the Family Stone, Sha Na Na, the sort of doo-wop throwback band, Richie Havens, the great folk performer, Mountain, and then the band. Hendrix was the last to perform. He performed at 8:30 in the morning, Monday morning, and played his famous rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. We can talk a bit more about that in a moment. Here you can see just the vastness. If you can notice the people, it looks like just a series of dots, but those are people up on the other hill as well. And you can see the stage is kind of engulfed by the crowd there, but you can especially see the speakers up on the towers and so on. So just a huge amount of humanity. And the film focuses on aspects of that. It focuses on some of the people making their way toward the concert. It focuses on people bathing or going skinny dipping in the surrounding waters. And it focuses on the human level in a lot of ways. The people that are sort of in the mud, the people that are connecting with each other, with strangers that happen to have been at the same concert, right? And this sense of community, this sense of belonging together, even if you are strangers, because you're tied together by a love of music, the possibilities of the counterculture, the possibilities of this higher order of humanitarianism. And so the film really plays on these tropes. It's another one of those documentaries where there's no narrator. You just hear interviews with the people that are there, and then you see performances of the band. So you get this sense, and even the interviews are really just them sort of talking about their experiences. They're not being fed questions so much. And you see them working in the makeshift hospital. You see them working at hydration stations and so on to keep people healthy, to look after each other. And it is this kind of almost utopian moment. The other aspect of the film, of course, is the performances, but the performances are very heavily edited in ways that don't denature the performance itself. The soundtrack isn't what's edited, it's the visuals, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. There's a particular scene that I want you to focus on. Here you see Creedence Clearwater Revival performing at the concert. And here, of course, you see Hendrix. And that performance of Hendrix's of the Star Spangled Banner is, I think, justly celebrated. Keep in mind, it's 8:30 Monday morning. A lot of people had already gone home. The concert was really, to most people's minds, more or less over at that point. And he's playing the Star Spangled Banner. It's a sort of a traditional way of starting the day for official places, right? For schools sometimes in that era and so on. So that's part of the impetus behind playing it. And he always said that he just wanted to create this beautiful rendition of the anthem. That he's right in that the anthem is a very interesting melody. It's used to these wide leaps and the arpeggios and so on, and some suspensions, and it has a very distinctive character to it. But of course, most people heard it as a kind of protest. Some people angrily heard it as such, as though what he was doing was denaturing the national anthem, and that therefore this is a form of anti-nationalism, of apostasy with respect to patriotism, right? Anti-patriotism, kind of not quite seditious, but certainly not how one ought to comport oneself. Other people celebrated it as a virtuous act of protest about the Vietnam War, and as you know, because I'm hoping by this point you've watched the clip or you've listened to the audio. As you know, it begins more or less with the melody in a recognizable way, but almost immediately turns to these wails and screeching sounds that many people connect with the representations of Vietnam. Now, once again, he said that was not on his mind, but in a way, it doesn't matter. It's not what one intends. It's the impact something has in its cultural moment, right? And it didn't take very long for people looking back on that to think of that as its impact, and that's what it came to symbolize. And I think that's an interesting lesson, right? Maybe it's an obvious lesson, but maybe it's not. But meanings of things are not reliant upon intentions. The things that I'm saying now, for instance, I intend them a certain way. I'm hoping you'll take certain ideas and information out of it, but they may inspire in you totally other thoughts that weren't intended by me, and that becomes part of the meaning of what I'm saying. And not just of what I'm saying, but the meaning of what I'm doing. The fact that I'm sitting here in my bedroom with a microphone on my lap, and I'm talking to you in your absence. Before we've ever even met for the first time, I'm preparing this in an effort to connect with you, connect with people, some of whom I've never met before, right? Some of you that I'm attempting to connect with won't even come. You'll drop the class before it starts. That always happens, right? So there are all sorts of meanings in what I'm doing that are beyond the mere things I'm saying. And the same thing applies to what's going on with Hendrix's guitar performance here with Star Spangled Banner. So it's a temporary village, this place, right? It was a remarkable success considering the poor conditions and the almost constant rain. You can see how muddy it got there. The place was declared a disaster area shortly after, or as everyone was still there, and then after they left, it took a long time to fix it. It was in terrible shape, right? There were only 2 deaths. One was from an insulin overdose, and the other was from getting run over by a tractor while sleeping in a field, right? The farmer didn't know that someone was just sleeping in their field, and they accidentally ran the person over with a tractor. There were 2 births and 4 miscarriages, right? Those are pretty, considering the number of people and the lack of regimentation, the amount of sort of freedom and leaving it to people. The organizers really didn't set up hospital services or medical services. They figured they'd call emergency services, which was stupid given the fact that the place was so huge and so hard to access. But the people sort of did it themselves, right? And that's one of the things that gets celebrated in our memory of this moment, that people were able to do some of these things for themselves, take care of each other with an open heart and some good thinking. Here you can see another picture of just the vastness of the crowd and people sort of lying about and interacting in various ways. Now, I've already alluded to the film several times, but let's talk about it a bit more here. This is a documentary film that was released in 1970 by Michael Wadley, and you can see him there with the bandana tied around his head, or scarf maybe, I don't know. It was edited by Martin Scorsese. You can't see him in this picture at this moment, but he's actually, you can't see him at all because the text totally blacks him out. I'll show you him on the next slide. It was released through Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers was on the verge of bankruptcy at this point. We think of these huge conglomerates as being, in some ways, too big to fail, in a sense, right? They're impervious to the slings and arrows of lower scale capitalism, but that's not true. Warner Brothers was on the verge of collapse. It was on the verge of bankruptcy. This film was so successful that it saved the company, and I don't mean virtually saved the company. It brought them out of the red, and they were pretty deeply in the red. So this was a hugely successful film. Wadley couldn't even afford to pay the crew, so they agreed to a double or nothing deal. They got paid double their typical wages if the film succeeded, but nothing if it bombed. It succeeded, so they got double the money that they would normally have expected. The film brought the event to mythical status. It was an even bigger film as far as the cultural impact than the Monterey Pop Festival. It might not be, people's mileage will vary. Some people prefer the Monterey Festival film for various reasons, both as a film and as a set of recorded performances. Others will prefer the Woodstock film. The Woodstock film is clearly more tuned into the fact that this is meant to be a huge cultural event that it's documenting, whereas the Monterey Pop Festival seems less secure in its assurance that that's the case, that creates a kind of hype around the Woodstock film that's kind of built into the film itself, that they recognize that they're documenting an event that people will be talking about for years to come. The film brought the event to mythical status. It focused as much on the concert goers, concert goers, and the hippie sensibility, as well as the protests of Vietnam, as it did on the musicians and performances. And that's very different from the Monterey. So there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of scenes of people just being people, taking baths, being affectionate with each other, walking around the area, talking about the hospital services, talking about this or that, drug use, and so on. A key sequence derives from the Santana performance, and that's one of the things I want to think about here. This is one of the moments that really made Santana so hugely famous in this period, that this is one of the most effective sequences in the film. So there's a split screen that comes up that allows the audience members to see, or rather, that shows an audience members, a specific woman, her responses to Santana's guitar solo. So you see Santana kind of framed by this woman at times, and sometimes it's just simple split screen, and she goes through this whole journey, this whole kind of mental journey. Like he's playing something, and at first she kind of smiles, but then she stops smiling, and it's like she recognizes something, and she kind of nods, and then her smile gets even bigger, and the nod gets deeper, and it's like she's having some kind of epiphany. And this is soul sacrifice. It's this instrumental piece, this extended instrumental piece that becomes a pretty important single for Santana, even though instrumental pieces aren't necessarily the most influential anymore by the time you get to the end of the 60s, as they were in, say, the 20s and 30s. And so there's a sense in which there's a dawning awareness of some deeper inner truth that we're seeing portrayed. And then in watching her have an effective response to Santana, of course, we are supposed to have an effective response to her, and through her to Santana, right? We're sort of being guided in our emotional journey in relation to Santana's music through her reactions. And then there's a weird kind of bonding that arguably happens in that moment, where we're bonding with her. Even if we find it a little silly, some of her expressions, whenever you zoom in on someone's facial expressions and they're not contrived, acted out facial expressions, there's someone really in the moment, it always looks a little absurd, right? To actually see thoughts and emotions play out on someone's face, there's always something a little absurd about that. And Wadley focuses right in on her. And we see this whole thing unfolding. And yet the kind of naivety of it all, the kind of innocence of it all draws us in and makes us a part of the moment. Here's the same picture, but now you can see there he is, Martin Scorsese on the headset. He's the editor for the film. He was also more or less the assistant to Michael Wadley, and that's what you see him up to here. But before Martin Scorsese was Martin Scorsese, here he was an assistant to Mike Wadley. So one of the big acts, of course, at both the Monterey Pop Festival and Woodstock was Big Brother and the Holding Company featuring Janis Joplin. Janis Joplin grew up in Port Arthur, Texas, as a misfit. She didn't quite fit in school and so on. She hitchhiked to San Francisco with her friend Chet Helms. We've met him, right? One of the founding members of the Family Dog, and therefore the founding members of the San Francisco psychedelic scene, and also the curator and owner of the Avalon, right? So she hitchhiked to San Francisco in '63 with Chet Helms. In '64, she recorded some blues with the guitarist Jorma Kaukonen, later of Jefferson Airplane, in his home. That's known as the typewriter tapes because Kaukonen's wife is in the background typing. I don't know what she was typing, but you hear it throughout the whole thing, and it creates this sort of interesting percussive counterpoint. They're really worth, I think, checking out, and you can hear her at a pretty young age already sounding fully like Janis Joplin. She developed a bad drug and drinking problem, though, and so she returned to Port Arthur to get herself together, live with her folks again, to be watched over, in essence. And she feared returning to music. She certainly feared returning to the San Francisco scene because she was afraid it would lead to further abuse, right? She knew that on her own she got lonely. And that being around people in that environment where everyone's trying to get ahead, everyone's trying to get noticed, made her feel ever more lonely. And so she consciously, for a little while, tried to avoid that. But not for long, as we'll see. Big Brother, so now we're switching to Big Brother for a moment, that was formed by Chet Helms. He wasn't in the band. He was the impresario. He brought the various members together in 1965 as a sort of ideal psychedelic blues band. That's what he wanted. Their first performance was in January of 1966 at the Trips Festival, which he helped organize in San Francisco. Helms made them the house band at the Avalon Ballroom, so they played mostly progressive instrumental music. Now, Helms felt they needed a strong vocalist. They had a singer in the band, but he was not distinctive. He's not a bad singer. He's just not a distinctive singer. So he got Joplin to return to San Francisco. He basically got a friend of his to drive down and bring her back up and convince her to come. And he envisioned this band as being blues and technicolor. He envisioned it as being a kind of psychedelic blues. The band released a self-titled debut on Mainstream Records in August of '67, shortly following their success at the Monterey Pop Festival. The second album, though, now on Columbia Records, was Cheap Thrills, 1968, and that's the quintessential Big Brother and the Holding Company with Janis Joplin album. Right? It went to number 1 on the album charts. It included Piece of My Heart, which was a pop 12 release. And in the summer of '68, just after the release of Cheap Thrills, Joplin announced her departure from the band. So everything happens very quickly here, right? They're at the Monterey Pop Festival. Then right after that, they released their first album. Not long after that, less than a year later, they released their celebrated second album, now on a major record company, Columbia. And then she announces her departure right then, right after Woodstock. So we're talking about a little over a year total of time from when they play at Monterey to when she leaves right after Woodstock. So a very short tenure for this band, but that album in particular, Cheap Thrills, is a huge deal. Here you can see the album cover. The design is by Robert Crumb. You might recognize his approach, and you can see that he basically provides little cartoons for each of the songs. So a combination of the two, and you can see there's a 2 on stage. I Need a Man to Love with sort of a very exaggerated version of Janis Joplin on a bed, and kind of, I guess that's negligee or at least a tight-fitting dress, right? Summertime, we might think of that as a somewhat stereotyped and racist cartoon, right? But clearly drawing on the mammy image, alluding to the source of that song. That song is, of course, the Gershwin tune from the opera Porgy and Bess, the blues opera or jazz opera Porgy and Bess. And their version of it, that's one of the ones that I think is worth listening to. Their version of it is quite remarkable, just in the way that it uses the two guitars that are available to them to create this new orchestration for this tune. It doesn't sound at all like jazz, the way that they sing it. It sounds like a blues song, but it sounds like the description of Chet Helms is that it's blues and technicolor is very apt for that tune, because after all, I mean, Summertime is not a blues progression by any means. It has some blues inflections within it, because after all, it's meant to represent African American music, and the typical way of doing that when Gershwin wrote this tune was to include blues inflections. But the like I said, the interaction between the counterpoint really between the two guitars is really quite remarkable in the way that they build towards certain climaxes, especially leading to her entrance, her vocal entrance. It's worth listening to several times. Notice that Robert Crumb tries to capture some of the energy that Janis Joplin brings to singing, when over there on the right where it says Janis Joplin vocal and her mouth's wide open, and it seems like she's shouting out, right, to everyone. The central cartoon is, of course, of their cover of Ball and Chain. And there's live material here as well as studio material, and you can see that's mentioned there, where it was done at Bill Graham's Fillmore, right, one of the important San Francisco venues for the scene overall. So an amazing album, and an amazing, I think, a very interesting album cover. And you can see how album covers now that we're in the late 60s, they're becoming more and more part of the statement. Part of, he's trying to, with these various cartoons, he's trying to create this kind of mythic world for each of the songs, right? Trying to create this sense that each of the songs have a kind of presence, have a kind of place within the aesthetic of the album as a whole. So the album, even though this is not a concept album, it's clearly a statement of the album as art, right? She goes solo with I Got Them Old Cosmic Blues Again, Mama, in 1969. That's number 5 on the album charts. The Cosmic Blues Band was modeled on the Stax Volt R&B sound, so you have all these horns, all these sounds that you didn't have available to her in Big Brother. So there's a shift here, almost toward the Otis Redding Stax sound for a little bit. So a lot more horns, just a really interesting sound overall on that album. But by October 4th of 1970, just as we saw with Jimi Hendrix, she dies of an overdose. Her album Pearl, which is a number 1 in 1971, that was released posthumously, that has her version of Me and Bobby McGee, right? Her cover of the Chris Christopherson tune, which many people think of as really central to her legacy. We've already talked a little bit about Carlos Santana. Let's come back to him. He's a Mexican-American guitarist, founded the group Santana in San Francisco in 1966, and he had his first major audition with the Family Dog Show at the Avalon Ballroom in the summer of 67. Chet Helms said that he should keep his job as a dishwasher because Latin rock would never catch on with an audience. So Chet Helms was a bit of a hater in this case, right? He didn't see a place for that. That kind of Latin-infused psychedelia. By 69, though, Santana had a deal with Columbia Records and had a manager that did believe in him very much, Bill Graham. And Carlos Santana, of course, has a great deal of talent. He's an amazing guitarist. Really, he doesn't develop as much as some other guitarists over the course of the 70s. He kind of finds his style early and then sticks with it. But he's still a very interesting guitarist and has a nice way of reconciling the blues and Latin elements with some jazz-like elements. But part of his rise to fame really has to be credited to Bill Graham, who knows how to work with that talent, who knew how to promote it, how to not so much shape it in its development. Carlos Santana took care of that, but how to shape its approach to a wider audience. Let's take a look at some of that. The breakout success, of course, was at Woodstock. He was only allowed to join Woodstock, because he's largely unknown at the time, because he had asked Graham to help, because they had asked Graham to help organize it. So Graham said, sure, I'll help you organize this big thing, because keep in mind, Graham at this point, he's organized a ton of various concerts, both large level and small level. He's been running Fillmore West and now Fillmore East for a while. He's been running Fillmore West for quite a while. Then he also opened up Fillmore East. So he says, sure, he's sort of the guy that knows how to do all this stuff in the room. Those other guys, they were people who were building recording studios. They didn't know about throwing festivals. That's why it's so amazing that Woodstock even worked. They weren't really up to that job. And they got lucky a lot. Well, one of the ways that they manufactured luck was by taking as much advice as they could get from Graham. But Graham did this with some strings attached. He said he would do it. He said he would do it with really hardly any financial reward, or at least any direct financial reward. But he did want that Santana should be allowed to play on the roster. Right? Now, Santana's basically unknown at this time, so that's a big deal. And as we've already mentioned with that scene when he's playing Soul Sacrifice, that really made him this icon. It put him on a level with Jimi Hendrix. It put him on a level with the kind of musicians that were playing there at Woodstock. And he's making that same kind of guitar solo as spiritual adventure kind of presentation that we see with Hendrix. And the film, the Michael Wadley film, really brings that out in a lot of ways. It focuses on him in a way that kind of glorifies what he's up to and the kind of message that he's bringing to an audience. So Santana follows that performance up with 3 major albums. There's Santana of 69, which has, of course, Soul Sacrifice on it. There's Abraxas of 70, perhaps his most celebrated album. And then Santana 3, which from 71. Santana played Woodstock on August 16th, and his album was released on August 30th. So it really capitalized on the buzz around his name from that performance. It reached number 4 on the album charts. That is really high for a debut album. Over half of the first album is instrumental in the manner of a free-form jazz band, including its largest track, Soul Sacrifice, which was the huge hit at Woodstock. So that's very odd. A number 4 album, which is roughly half instrumental and half singing, that is Latin-infused psychedelic rock, which really no one had heard before. I mean, they heard both elements, but having them brought together in this way before, it's an astounding feat to have it chart that high. But then we have Altamont, and Altamont is in every way the inverse of Woodstock. Altamont took place on December 6th, 1969. That's already, I guess, a bit of an inverse, right? I mean, we go from the hot summer to the winter, but of course we're talking about the winter in California, so that doesn't have the same impact. At any rate, it was organized by the Rolling Stones, Jefferson Airplane, and Grateful Dead as a Woodstock West at Altamont Speedway in Northern California. Now, they only secured the location 2 days prior to the concert, so they didn't have the proper facilities. They didn't have the portable toilets, the medical facilities, all that. It wasn't set up properly or adequately. It was set up last minute. Now, again, the same thing more or less applies to Woodstock, right? They had a bit more planning to go into it, but not enough really for the size of what they were doing. But they got lucky over and over again. They got lucky because the people that showed up were people that were disposed to working for this situation, to making it work. And for whatever reason, and there are probably numerous ones that we'll allude to or imagine over the course of our discussion here, for a number of reasons, Altamont was not the same situation. People weren't willing to take part in it in the same way. Part of that had to do with a certain amount of hostility that was brought to it, as we'll see, by the Hells Angels, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There were approximately 300,000 people in attendance. The featured artists were Santana, Jefferson Airplane, the Flying Burrito Brothers, right? Graham Parsons Group, the great country rock group, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and of course the Rolling Stones as the headliner. Now the Grateful Dead was supposed to follow Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, but they wouldn't go on. They decided this, even though they helped organize the concert. It was really three groups that helped organize the concert: Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, and it really was Grateful Dead that did most of the legwork, and Rolling Stones, who provided most of the money. So the Grateful Dead really were the primary agents in organizing this thing, but they wouldn't go on when they saw the level of violence in the crowd. They said that this was not something they wanted to be associated with, and they didn't want to perform for people that were in that state of chaos, right? Now remember, we've been talking about chaos as a good thing all last session and this session. This idea of the Dionysian, well, that involves chaos, right? And there's this utopic vision of the Dionysian that runs through much of the 60s, that you can lose the boundaries of the self, you can be immersed in your world, you can connect to other human beings, you can let go of conscious control and attain a kind of higher consciousness, a freer consciousness. But all that involves a giving up of the self, right? A giving up of the boundaries, a giving up of the limitations of law and of social mores and so on. But here we see the inverse side of that. And the Dead recognize that. Now, you got to keep in mind, the Dead, Jerry Garcia in particular, he often sort of, he had a lot of friends that were Hell's Angels. He was interested in that side of the chaotic as well. But when it came down to it, they recognized that this was dangerous, that this was not a good scene, and they backed out of performing, right? But that's always the danger there. That there might be a good element to chaos, a good element to that losing of control, freeing up possibilities. But some of that energy that you free up has been pent up for a reason, right? That doesn't mean it should remain pent up. Penting things up is probably not the greatest idea. Repression never works out very well, right? But if you don't channel it in some direction that is useful, the way that people did somewhat naturally, but that's not natural. Some people must have decided that they were going to make this work, and they gathered people around them that were like-minded, and then they made it work. People who had some medical training were working in the makeshift hospital. That same kind of thing didn't happen at Altamont. And so here you see another crowd scene. This is of Altamont now. You can see that even the way it's set up is not great. Unlike the usual situation where the stage is higher than the group, here the group of people, the audience, is higher looking down at the stage. That's not an impossible situation. There are plenty of outdoor auditorium spaces that work this way and have made it work. But it contributes a little bit to the crush, I think, toward the front of the stage, which was very different. Again, with Woodstock, people sort of enjoyed staking out their own space. The stage was, of course, a locus of attention, but it wasn't as centripetal. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. Centripetal, not centrifugal, right? Centripetal means pulling in toward the center. The stage in Woodstock wasn't as centripetal. It didn't pull you in toward its center in the same way. You had your own sort of area where you were dancing, you were connecting with others, and you heard the music emanating out of the center. With Altamont, maybe partly because of the landscape, maybe partly because of the lack of facilities, maybe partly just because of a different vibe in general among the audience, the stage held a kind of centripetal force. It pulled people in. It drew people to it, and there was a kind of crush toward the front. People were really striving to get up closer and closer to the front. And the Rolling Stones paid the Hells Angels as a security outfit, right? They paid them for security. Now, it's not like this is the only time that gangs have been used or will be used as a security force. And sometimes that works out well, and sometimes it doesn't. Right? And you have different kinds of gang activity, but they paid the Hells Angels $500 worth of beer. That was their payment. So they're drinking while acting as a security force. And of course, they have a different sense of how they want to have themselves represented. Their sense of masculinity, to some extent at that time, depends on a level of violence and being perceived as violent. And to be perceived as violent, one way to have that happen is to be seen engaging in violence. And that's a lot of what is happening here. They were drinking all day and it got increasingly involved with fights. Instead of just stopping them like they're supposed to, instead of pulling people apart, they're throwing punches as well. Marty Balin, just to show you how out of hand this got, of the Jefferson Airplane, at one point he jumps off the stage to try to settle the commotion because he sees that the Angels are beating up some of the members of the audience. Instead of pacifying them, they're making everything worse. So he jumps down to try to serve as a middleman, as a negotiator, as a pacifier. And instead he's knocked unconscious. The Hell's Angel punches him. So here you have a security guard ostensibly there to protect the performers, who's now punched out one of the performers. Not just one of the performers, but the lead singer. And so one of the other members of the band steps up to the mic and goes, you just knocked out our lead singer. You know, what is it that you expect us to do now, right? And they bring him back to consciousness. And he goes on in place, but he's knocked out cold for a little while. There aren't too many examples of that kind of thing happening where the security force knocks out the lead performer. The Rolling Stones didn't go until nightfall, and there was a huge hole in the program, partly because the Grateful Dead decided not to play, partly because the security was out of hand and with the Hells Angels, and everyone was sort of afraid to give the Hells Angels a talking to, so they thought, well, let's just leave a gap, and maybe everything will calm down, tempers will cool, right? That didn't work because throughout the crowd, people are getting drunk and they're doing heavy drugs. Some of them are doing marijuana, but some are doing heavier drugs, right? People are getting more and more agitated. People are getting more and more intense. And there's a lot of negative interaction throughout the crowd during this. And so the crowd's driven by boredom and by the chaos of the whole thing. They're becoming increasingly agitated, not less agitated. They're becoming more of a problem, not less of a problem. And then you have the famous moment, of course. Now, notice this. This is another picture from Altamont. You got to ask yourself, where do the pool cues come from? Why do they have pool cues, right? The Hells Angels have pool cues. There's no pool table outside at Altamont Speedway, right? They're bringing things that will serve as weapons. They're bringing things that like they're having a pool room fight or something. But the big moment, the moment that really disgraces the concert as a whole, involves Meredith Hunter, who's an 18-year-old black fan of the Rolling Stones. He pulls a gun at the front of the stage. He apparently, he was there with his girlfriend. His girlfriend claims that he was getting more and more out of it, more and more inebriated, intoxicated. And then he had pulled his gun a couple times already on people and threatened them. And he had moved his way up toward the front of the stage, and he pulled a gun. And he's beaten to death by the Hells Angels. And all this is captured on film by Albert and David Mayles for their film on the Rolling Stones, which was released in 1970 called Gimme Shelter. Another example of direct cinema, right? This is one of the sort of celebrated examples of direct cinema. And one of the things they do in this film that I do think is interesting, and you can see this clip on YouTube if you're interested, is they have Mick Jagger, the lead singer for the Rolling Stones, watched the footage of Meredith Hunter being stomped to death, of him being killed, while the Rolling Stones continue to play their set. They're continuing to play a song. And they have him watch it and react to it. And it's an interesting moment. I don't think Mick Jagger comes off particularly well. He tries to be sympathetic. He tries to be obviously mournful. And he laments that it happened. I don't know that he could. I don't think there's any way he could have reacted that would have been satisfactory, though, to be honest. I think it's a difficult situation all the way around. You now have, as part of a film that was meant to glorify the band, that was meant to be a document of how great the band was in 1969, 1970, and now in the middle of it is a murder. A man lost his life, and you played on. And even though you weren't aware of it, there's no way you can help but look callous, having set it up without taking responsible action, just because you saw that worked with Woodstock. Woodstock had no right, in a sense, to work as well as it did, but it did. Altamont, I guess, had no right to be as bad as it was either, right? Both are kind of extremes. Altamont had no reason to be that bad. and Woodstock had no reason to be that good. And that amount of unpredictability, I think, is part of what leads to the demise of the rock festival, and that's what we're going to look at next. Rolling Stone magazine called this. By the way, so there were 3 accidental deaths along with the murder of Meredith Hunter, so 4 deaths total. 2 by hit and runs, and you know, right in the middle of all this chaos, somebody hits someone else with their car 2 different times and leaves. Right? There were a ton of stolen cars, a lot of property damage. It was a mess. It was a fiasco. The Woodstock area was declared a disaster area because of all the rain and all the people in the rain and not having proper drainage for that many people in that area. It became basically a swamp. But it wasn't a disaster area because people had behaved in an egregious fashion. They were pretty well behaved overall. Even the people who were against having Woodstock there in Bethel had to admit that the people were well behaved and respectful. The exact opposite was the case at Altamont. Rolling Stone magazine called it, quote, rock and roll's all-time worst day. December 6th, the day when everything went perfectly wrong. Other big festivals toward the end here. We have the Isle of Wight, 26th through August of 1970, and the demise of the rock festival aesthetic. This festival was the third of the Isle of Wight festivals. It may have been one of the largest gatherings of humans of all time. 700,000 people in one relatively small place. It might be the largest amount of people in one place in all of world history, perhaps. Thought of by many critics as the last of the great 60s styles rock festivals. This one was fairly successful, maybe not as iconic as Woodstock. But then let's discuss the death of the Rock and Roll Festival. From 1970 to 1991, the year of the first Lollapalooza tour, there were very, very few successful rock festivals. This is particularly surprising when you realize that in the span of 67 to 69, there were over 25 large-scale rock festivals that were either profitable or became profitable later because of film releases or whatever. Altamont was a major contributor, obviously, to the decline of the festival, in that it seemed to confirm the denigration of rock and the festivals as celebrations of sex, drugs, criminality. After Altamont, these festivals became nearly impossible to organize over the legal obstacles and the opposition of local communities. If Woodstock brought some goodwill to the rock festival so that people thought, well, maybe we could do that here, Altamont ruined that. And Woodstock only brought so much goodwill because it's not like the people that attended Woodstock, they weren't for the most part spending a ton of money in the local areas, right? That winds up being one of the justifications for Lollapalooza later in the 90s, as we'll see, that people that were coming from far off, they were going to stay in hotel rooms, they were going to do things that use campgrounds and so on, and they were going to help the local economy. That wasn't really the case for Woodstock. So even though Woodstock went well, it didn't do anything for the locals that made them necessarily want more festivals. And that was the original idea of the Woodstock festivals, that this would be something that would happen regularly. And of course, it did not happen that way. But Altamont proved that these festivals weren't only not profitable to the local community, but that were perhaps dangerous, deleterious to the local community. And so many local communities objected. In 1970 alone, county officials in Virginia shut down a proposed festival with threats of legal injunctions. Festival organizers in Florida were actually arrested on inane charges, ridiculous charges, to intimidate them. And they just kept getting arrested over trumped up charges to intimidate them until they gave up putting together a festival. A festival in Illinois was canceled owing to community protest. Legal proceedings were brought against proposed festivals in Boston, Iowa, and Philadelphia. Oklahoma's governor, Dewey Bartlett, called on 300 National Guardsmen to stop a festival in Oklahoma, saying, quote, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I don't think drugs, nudity, free love, and lawlessness are needed to have a good time over the weekend, right? So notice how he's characterizing this kind of, that it's not about music, because he might argue that music is a way to have a good time over the weekend, but he says that it's drugs, nudity, free love, and lawlessness. That's what these festivals represent to him. Right? And this is all in 1970. All the things I'm mentioning on this slide, this is all 1 year. In upstate New York, people trying to attend a festival near Toronto were denied entry into Canada because they couldn't prove that they had sufficient funds to support themselves during the stay. Right? So this idea of being a hippie type and going to Woodstock, and you just sort of make your way there, and you depend on the kindness of others, and you live in a tent, or maybe just lying on the ground, maybe with a sleeping bag, maybe not. That's not going to fly. Right? That you have to prove basically that you're not in violation of vagrancy laws, that you have sufficient money with you to support yourself wherever you go. You can see that this is a organized or a sort of distributedly organized, right? Not organized as in everyone together, but within each of these areas, an organized assault on this idea of what a rock festival represents and what it can do and what should be allowed and what should not be allowed. Let's take a look at a few examples. The Medicine Ball Caravan is a good one, right? Here you see a poster for it. So one of the issues that they faced, and that many of the organizers of these kinds of festivals faced, was cash related, right? They're looking to cash in on the opportunity that they thought Woodstock represented, but they didn't handle funding well, or maybe it was nearly impossible to handle it well. I mean, like I said, Woodstock got lucky. Remember, they didn't make any money from Woodstock. They made money from the film, right? Which is in a way making money from Woodstock, but not from the concert as such. They made money from the film. They would have gone bankrupt otherwise. So these festivals, they're not easy to organize and profit from. And so the organizers of a proposed festival called the Medicine Ball Caravan, they were accused of commercialism because they knew they weren't going to make that much money from the ticket sales, and they wanted to keep the ticket sales low. So they get corporate money by Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers was going to fund, I forget what percentage, let's say 50%, but I don't remember the exact percentage of the festival. And then everyone says, oh, well, you guys are just sellouts. You're just giving in to the man. So these organizers, they're caught between two extremes. They are supposed to somehow not charge very much the people that are coming. But if they use corporate money, then they're not authentic. Celebration of Life shows another issue, right? The reputation of Woodstock as a free festival, even though it wasn't really, made audiences resistant to pain. And with the harder drugs that are being used, instead of just marijuana, which was the main drug of choice at Woodstock, things got violent quickly, like they did at Altamont, right? Gate crashing was an epidemic. So people were losing money when they put together these things. And yet the bands who didn't ask for anything at Monterey Pop Festival, remember the only one that got paid there was Ravi Shankar. People did get paid for Woodstock, but relatively low sums. Now they're demanding higher and higher fees. For the Celebration of Life Festival, Hendrix, who before was willing to play at festivals like this for $1,500, is now demanding $100,000, partly because his moments at the Monterey Pop Festival and the Woodstock Festival were so iconic that they were thought of as being the highlight of the festival. So he just assumed that people were going to come to the Celebration of Life Festival in order to see another iconic moment, right? And so he wanted to be recompensed for that expectation, for the drawing power of that. But that's a huge hike in the amount of money that he's asking for. This is from the Celebration of Life Festival, so you can see again the skinny dipping and so on. The Celebration of Life Festival is an attempt really to recreate Woodstock, and it fails financially and culturally in a lot of ways. One of the things that happens, of course, is people get stranded, and here you can see them trying to get back home, right? There's much less of a sense of community than there was. Like I said, Woodstock really is a freakish moment. People like to think of it as emblematic of the 60s, or better yet, representative. It might be emblematic of the 60s in some ways, but it's not representative. It really is a freak moment, and it's worth celebrating and worth being excited about. I'm not suggesting it's not, but we have to be mindful of the fact that it should not have worked as well as it did. And the idea that all these other organizers of rock festivals are hoping to have another Woodstock was foolish. It was naive, and they suffered the consequences of their naivety. A great example is the Powder Ridge Rock Festival. This, I think, is the case study for the failure of the rock festival. Powder Ridge Rock Festival of 1970 was in Connecticut. It was kind of an inverse Woodstock, right? The promoter, Raymond Filiberti, lost the court injunction against his holding the festival at a ski resort where he planned to have it. He was told he can't have it there, right? But He was an idiot, and he already sold roughly 30,000 tickets at $20 each. That's roughly $130 today. It's not chump change. It's not nothing, right? And especially for people who are underemployed, the way that generation often was, of young people that were going to that kind of concert, that was a decent amount of money. The festival was canceled, but the ticket holders showed up anyway. He didn't refund them. He didn't send their money back. And we'll see what happens with that in a moment. But so they show up anyway, even though none of the bands are coming. The only artist that shows up at all is Melanie, an artist who was also at Woodstock. Not one of the bigger ticket names, really, right? She's the only one that showed up at all. Two local bands then jumped up to play impromptu sets, but most of the attendees entertained themselves, mostly with drugs, and the drug use was bad. There were a lot of overdoses. Over 1,000 people at Powder Ridge had medical emergencies that were mostly drug-related, and there were no hospital people, no doctors, no medics on the scene because the festival was canceled. They weren't supposed to be there. There was no reason to be there. One dealer was arrested, and he had $13,000 in his pocket. $13,000 of 1970 money. That's a lot of money just selling to people at a resort, right? Now, as I mentioned, Filiberti, he didn't refund any of the ticket sales. He didn't refund their money. He went bankrupt, supposedly, and he was indicted on 6 counts of perjury over the missing money. He wouldn't say where it went. He got 4 years in prison. Clearly, this put a lot of fear into potential festival organizers. Why should they put together a festival when it's so dangerous? There's so many pitfalls. The local community wants nothing to do with it. It's getting more and more of a reputation for hard drug use and illicit activity. It's hard to organize just logistically. Places don't want to host them. Places like the Powder Ridge ski resort will agree and then decide not to agree. And then you've already sold some tickets and you shouldn't have. You should have been more careful, but you weren't. It's just a big mess. And so they fall into the decline. People don't want to take those risks. Here you see the people with Powder Ridge waiting for nothing, sitting there for bands that are not coming, that in a way that most of them know aren't coming. I don't know what they were even thinking, to be honest. Here you can see the setup for the band for the scene, and you can see on the smaller stage one of the local bands are playing on that smaller stage. But again, sort of waiting for nothing. People trying to get back home, overloading that truck to get there. And then I think one of the iconic pictures, right? That you can see they're so bored, they have nothing to do. They're up on the ski lift just for something, just to be something somewhere. All those people, nothing to do. And that's what the rock festival amounts to. By 1970. And then for roughly 2 decades, throughout the 70s and the 80s, there aren't any notable rock festivals. It's not until 1991 and the return of the rock festival because of Lollapalooza that there's an investment in this again. And so this becomes part of the kind of mythos of the 1960s, that for a while, for a brief moment, for a flash in the pan, these things were possible and they meant something. They offered a glimpse of a utopia where people take care of each other, but that was the exception, not the rule. For the most part, people were bored, drugged out, waiting for nothing. There's something cheery for you, and I will see you at the next session.